it's yeah, it's a serious piece of kit. I mean, it's clearly a hand-to-hand weapon. It's not for range delivery, but there we are. Yeah.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming to this Uppsala Books live event. I'm Professor Leonard Neidorf, and it's my pleasure to be the MC tonight. And we have a very special guest in attendance, none other than Stephen Pollington, the author of Woden, a historical companion, one of the newest releases from Uppsala Books, a book that is generating a lot of interest and has been generating interest for months, actually, well before it was even released. And we're here to celebrate its release and spend some time with its author. So I'm going to read a little bit about Steve, and then I'm going to say a few more words about Steve that are...
Oh dear. That sounds ominous, doesn't it?
Stephen Pollington has been writing about the history of early medieval Europe for more than 30 years on topics as diverse as weapons and warfare, the medical tradition, aspects of religion, kingship, writing systems, and linguistics, using literary, archaeological, and comparative sources. Many of his books have become standard works for their subjects, and he has also contributed to reference works such as the Oxford Companion to Military History. He teaches Old English language and literature with the City Literary Institute, London, and gives presentations on a wide range of related topics. Now, that is a kind of standard biographical introduction, but what really serves to introduce Steve is actually the list of publications that he has generated over the years, which is truly impressive. And I just want to name a couple of items because I think Steve is the author of some truly beloved books that you've seen in the gift shops at Sutton Hoo and all over England, wherever you go, wherever there's heritage, you see Steve Pollington's books in those gift shops. And some of the books that I would just highlight as special ones, I think of Wordcraft, English to Old English Dictionary and Thesaurus, published in 1993. Rudiments of Rune Lore, first published in 1995. The English Warrior from 1996. First Steps in Old English from 1997, a book that I know many people have learned Old English from. Leechcraft, Early English Charms, Plant Lore and Healing from 2000. Mead Hall from 2003. We can move forward a bit. Wayland's Work, Anglo-Saxon Art from the 4th to the 7th Century from 2010. A very special book, Elder Gods, The Other World of Early England. And there's many more titles that I could mention, but I'll just highlight those because I think these are really fan favorites, books that have helped fill a niche in the literary space and enabled people to learn a lot about our period. So without further ado, let's turn it over to Steve for a presentation on Woden, the First 1,000 Years.
Thank you, Professor Neidorf. That's very encouraging words. If I can get this to work, you should now have a blank blue screen to stare at. And we'll just get... Come on, you can do it. There we are. Yeah, the first 1,000 years. So, which will give you a clue that I'm not today going to talk about the Scandinavian, the Norse, shall we say, the medieval Norse tradition in any detail. And the reason for that is we've only got an hour, 2 hours with the discussion afterwards, and it's going to be a struggle to get the first elements in, the Woden rather than the Odin period. There's so much material to cover. The evidence for Woden, of course, is partly literary sources. In fact, that's probably the source from which we know the greatest detail about the god and the kinds of things that he does and the kinds of worship that takes place. But the archaeology is every bit as instructive. And once you get beyond the hesitancy with which we sort of leap the boundary from lit crit studies and linguistic studies over into the archaeology, then all kinds of possibilities open up. An area that is quite difficult to deal with is toponymy, place name studies. It's a whole separate thing in its way, which has a bearing, certainly a strong bearing on evidence for the physical, real world worship and of the god Woden and other religious practices. But it is absolutely fraught with potential hazards, pitfalls. One of which is that one can never be entirely sure how old a place name is. If we're lucky and it's been recorded in the medieval period, the late Anglo-Saxon period, then that's a clue, but we don't have literary records from the time when the worship of Woden was part of the dominant ideology of the society that undertook it. So it has to be used, but used with caution. I shan't be going into it today. There's also, because we're going to be looking at the early evidence for Woden, there are two assumptions that have to be cleared, I would say, really, dealt with, tackled, before we can go anywhere. The first of those is that the older medieval literary sources can tell us nothing about actual history. And I know Professor Shippey has written about the responsibility that JRRT has in that respect, that he had his own reasons for trying to divorce works of literary creativity from the historical context in which they were written. These works are often based on legend and folklore, and so the argument goes they're just not reliable. If there happens to be a nugget of truth in there, you can't identify it, so it's not really worth the trouble of attempting to do so. The other assumption is that medieval Icelandic sources have no bearing at all on anything that one might find in the archaeology of the post-Roman or early medieval period in Europe, because the distance in time, several hundred years, and in space, 1,000 miles plus, just makes it impossible that any evidence from the one area could possibly have any bearing on the other area. And that actually was the position that most scholars adopted post-Second World War, I would say. It became very unfashionable to try to tie up anything from the early medieval period with things recorded much later and a long way away. But I think both those assumptions are wrong, because I think details found in the archaeological record are sometimes illuminated by details found in the literary record, and they don't necessarily conflict with each other. And I think it's important to use both with all due caveats in our assessment of the evidence. Which sort of brings us on to the first question: is what are we going to be looking for? We're looking for a character called Woden. So first thing then is to try to identify the word Woden in texts and to find alternative versions of it, versions in other languages. In Old English, the name is usually spelt with a wound, the character that looks like a P, but it's transliterated with a W, so we'll stick with that. It's also transliterated with a double U, with two U's, which is a very early spelling tradition, which you find, I think, in Northumbrian texts. So, amongst the Longobards, the name appears as Godan by a linguist, an orthographic change, probably, that generates that form in Longobardic. Amongst the speakers of Old High German, it's Wotan. Amongst the speakers of Old Low German and Old Saxon, it appears to be Woden again. And then in Old Danish, we have two runic texts which specify this chap. One, Woden, without a vowel in the final syllable, and the other, Usin, but clearly related to the words Orden and Oden, which appear in the literary text. And of course, when we get into the 11th century, Saxo Grammaticus, writing about the early history of the Danes, he Latinizes the form as Othinus, Othinus, or is it Othinus? It's never really clear. But the Icelandic sources certainly use the eth character, so we know that it's Othin by that. And these forms all point back to a proto-form, an unrecorded but reconstructed hypothetical form, which either comes out as Wozanas or Wozina. The difference is immaterial, really, but it affects the quality of the vowel of the main syllable in Old English, at least, which is why you have Wardensfield, but Wednesday. The O and the E are one isn't taken from the other. So that's what we're looking for in terms of versions of the name in these various languages. There are, to the best of my knowledge, no forms of the name that appear in any of the East Germanic languages, which for practical purposes mean Gothic. But the bulk of the Gothic texts that we have, Gothic language texts, are translations of the Bible and commentary thereon. And so there's really no reason that the name of a god such as Woden should have appeared in anything that survived. Did they have the name? Well, if they did, there's no evidence for it. And there are other reasons for thinking that perhaps the rise of the cult of Woden as the principal god, at least, happened at a time when the Goths were already sundered from what was going on in northern and western Europe. So it's a possibility. Other than looking for the name, what else might one look for? Given that we know something of the character of the god from the Scandinavian, particularly Icelandic records, we could be looking for physical representations of a figure, for example, with two birds, a figure flanked by two birds, such as Hugin and Munin appear to flank the figure of Odin in Icelandic text. Or we might be looking for a figure with one eye. But there's always a danger of circular reasoning, isn't there? A figure with two birds doesn't necessarily have to be Odin, and indeed a figure with two birds could be St. Francis of Assisi. Let's be, frank. The possibilities are endless. It doesn't have to be Odin, but in some contexts, and where the originating culture of the object suggests that it's from a pre-Christian Germanic society, then we can maybe allow this into the consideration. Figure lacking an eye, of course, well, that could be due to physical damage to the object. One can never discount that entirely, but there are instances, and we'll be looking at one shortly, of a disfigured representation of a face where the damage to the eye is clearly deliberate. It's not something that's happened accidentally. And in fact, if we had a whole day on this, I could show you numerous instances of eye modification. But for today's purpose, we'll just go with what we have here. The literary and linguistic history has already got going by the 5th century, because we can say this with some certainty because we have a 5th century artifact with some writing on it that indicates Woden, and we have a 5th century modified object with the eyes interfered with. So if we're taking literary evidence with the name and archaeological evidence with a modified eye, then straight away, the 5th century is the point at which these things have already started to appear. And of course, the big sensation in this area was the find of a bracteate at Vinv in Jutland. Actually, almost central in Jutland, not far from Scabbard. So, in modern Denmark, at the time when the deposition of this item was made, Denmark, to the extent that it existed at all, was the area of the Danes, and it probably included Skåne, which is the area on the right of the larger map there, around Malmö in Sweden, Halmstad, that sort of area. And in the 5th, 6th century, the Danes were moving into Sealand, which is the larger of the Danish islands, where Copenhagen stands. But at this time, the 5th century, the 450, 475, something like that, it's unlikely that there were any Danes at all dominant in Jutland. That process was underway, but it was by no means complete. So we're not looking at, it's a mistake to think that these items, because they're found in a region that is now politically Denmark, that they belong to a culture that is in any way Danish. It's a Jutland culture, and it's a different thing, not entirely, but it's a different thing in detail. So, and we'll also be looking at the finds from Helvig, the helmet, which is Gotland, a little further north, out into the Baltic Sea. So the bracteate caused something of a stir when it was found, which was 2021, I think, although it wasn't actually published until last year. A detailed study of this bracteate and the other, I think, 7 that were found in the hoard, alongside some other bits of gold and weapon fittings and jewelry and so on. They were all studied by the archaeology and conservatory team at National Museum in Copenhagen. And Lisbeth Immer and Christer Vassus went to a great deal of trouble establishing the facts of the inscriptions and the possible meanings of them before any of this stuff was made public. Excuse me. So the bracteate, I'm sure most of you know this, but I'll remind you anyway. A bracteate is a thin gold, usually foil disc, a pendant, about the size of, for the benefit of English people anyway, it's about the size of a milk bottle top. I don't know what the size of a milk bottle top is in Sweden or North America, but we're talking about, I don't know, 25, 30 mil across, so an inch or thereabouts. They're not big things, they're not big showy things, but they're very detailed things, and they convey an awful lot of information. The classification of them has been handled certainly since the early 20th century. They fall into various types. Type C, which is the sort of thing we're looking at here, a rather exaggerated male head in profile, based on a Roman original with a diadem, the ties that secure it hanging down at the back, and the head is placed above. Well, it's usually called a quadruped. It looks like a horse, but it's got a crescent of horns on the brow. So if it is a horse, it's got a very peculiar bridle or harness or something. There's clearly something going on there. We haven't got time to worry about that today. There's also a gamadi on there, a swastika, a good luck symbol, but that seems to be simply part of the decorative scheme of the item. The outer bands of the item are punched with horseshoe shapes, pellets, repeated designs that create a textured effect and give a bit of glitter and sparkle from a practical point of view. Do they have some meaning? Well, I'm sure they do, but in all the years that I've been looking at these things, I've not yet found a correlation between the decoration of the outer band and the image that sits in the middle. So there's room for more work there. The runes have been, I won't say inked in, but they've been exaggerated and emboldened so that we can look at them by a graphic process. And the inscription is, well, given that the runes themselves are around 2 to 3 millimeters high, so what, 1/8 of an inch? I mean, they're incredibly small. The fact that we can see them at all and read some of them is in itself quite remarkable. The inscription runs right to left. It probably begins here at the word, which is either read Hosli or Hosti, depending on who you believe and how the thing is assumed to have been manufactured. The runes, the actual characters, would have been punched into the gold, but it would have been done with a very small, like a very delicate screwdriver, just tapped into the surface to make up the characters from these straight lines. And the inscription is difficult to interpret. Of course, it would be remarkable if it wasn't. And most of these bracteates contain a short inscription of 1 or 2 words, and nothing else. So here we have something approaching a sentence. This is little short of miraculous. You just never find it. So the item is in itself a remarkable thing. And it says, roughly, hostis, which is alleged to be based on the Latin word hostia, which is sacrifice. And then if you sort of squint a bit and don't ask too many questions, you can make out helpu, H-E, the L rune inverted and a P rune next to it, helpu maybe, ending in a U, then these are the corresponding runes. U-F-A-R, uvar, and then batai, which is assumed to be related to the verb fetch, patyon. So maybe it's the catcher, the grasper, the acquirer, something like that. The interesting bit, Yacha is Wodenas Weras. Yacha, the hunter, German Yacht. There is an English word based on yacht, which is the word yacht for a fast sailing vessel, but that comes in from Dutch in the early modern period. Yacha is a huntsman, is Wodenas Weras, and that's pretty clear. Wodenas, genitive singular of Wodenas, so of Woden, and whereas the exact form one would expect for the word wer, man, as in werewolf, a man. That's one of the few instances of the word wer that exists in modern. So an interesting thing, not something of a disappointment to the Danes, I think, because some of the linguistic forms that appear in this inscription are not ancestral to Danish. They have features that are simply not consistent with being a North Germanic inscription, and on that basis, you'd have to assume that the language of the originating culture, Central Jutland in the 5th or 4th century AD, was at that time not a North Germanic language. It has some North Germanic features, but it's not ancestral to Danish. So that in itself is interesting and backs up other reasons for thinking that at this period the culture on Jutland was not, the society was not Danish in any real sense. So it says sacrifices. I help from above, helpu uvar, vatai, the catcher in the dative thing. Yacha is vodnas wera. Fairly straightforward, but the issue is, what's the relationship between the text and the image? It's saying the hunter is Woden's man, but does that mean that this is Woden's man? Or does it mean that this is Woden, and it's which is the normal assumption about these images, and has been for 40, 50 years now, that these are representations of the god? I think that's undermined somewhat by this inscription. But of course, we don't know for sure the relationship between the text and the image. It's not a simple caption explaining what's going on. It was never meant to be that. And so it's interesting, it's tantalizing, it's very, very instructive in some ways in terms of the linguistic content. But unless we actually know what's going on in the scene is described by the text, it doesn't help too much. And having said that, in almost no other case is the runic text on a bracteate directly relatable to the imagery. You'll have three gods standing in a row, one holding a hammer, for example, but the text with it will just say alu, which is the word for ale. So the text that doesn't describe the scene routinely. Does it here? Is this the first time? I can't say it isn't, but it's not a natural inference from what we're looking. We looked, I mentioned also Helvi, on the island of Gotland, which is not in itself a particularly remarkable place, as I understand it. But there was a very remarkable find there, a Roman cavalry helmet, which was manufactured in the 2nd century AD, we assume, because that's the point at which these things came into fashion, possibly under the Emperor Commodus, 176 to 192, who was particularly keen on sporty things. He would have broken off and watched the rugby, I'm quite sure. The helmet it's a cavalry type with a full faceplate, but they were used not only for the battlefield stuff, they were used for parades and terrifying the locals in these sort of demonstrations of Roman power and so on. But it turned up it was probably made in the Rhineland, turned up in Gotland, which is 1,000 miles away. So there's a story there, clearly. And the whole helmet wasn't found, just the faceplate, which in itself is an unusual outturn. Why would you want just the faceplate of a helmet if you're intending to use it? If, for example, you were a Roman cavalryman whose origins were on Gotland and you returned home after your period of service, wouldn't you take the whole thing with you? Why would you just take the faceplate? Seems more reasonable, although nobody can prove this, but it does seem more reasonable that actually this was probably plunder, that it was taken from some hapless Roman cavalryman who met an untimely end, maybe somewhere in the Rhineland, and the faceplate formed part of the booty that was taken away, perhaps by somebody from Denmark, who then traded it on or handed it on in this economy of prestige that was in operation at that time, whereby high status goods circulated amongst the noble families in quite a wide area. And there's good evidence for that. We know that, for example, glass made in the Rhineland turns up in Scandinavia regularly. There's Byzantine tableware from Constantinople, Istanbul, that turns up at Sutton Hoo in Suffolk. Thousands of items of high quality prestige goods at this time turn up very, very far from their places of manufacture. And the inference is that they're passed around. They're the sorts of worthy gifts that make appropriate presentation for persons with whom one wishes to have good relation, or who you want to impress, people like that. The point about the helmet is, or the helmet faceplate, is that it was modified by having the helmets are used on the battlefield, so they have voids where the eyes are. But in this case, the eyes have been filled in. They've had little silver replacement eyes placed in them. But the Helvey one has had one of these eyes removed. So an originally eyeless helmet becomes a two-eyed helmet, two-eyed face, and then a one-eyed face, which is surely not accidental. That is the helmet's faceplate. It's been very badly damaged. It's split across the front there. This eye has always been in place. This eye was removed. It wasn't casual damage. I should explain that the circumstances of the discovery of the helmet were that a metal detecting chap on Gotland, when he died in 2011, his family had to dispose of his possessions, and they found a lot of stuff that he'd been collecting. Metal detecting is illegal on Gotland. It's illegal to export archaeological treasures. So clearly he was keeping it quiet because he didn't want to get in trouble with the authorities. But from the discovery of the helmet amongst his possessions and comparison with his notes, they worked out where he found this thing. They did an archaeological dig, and there was a substantial hall, really a long hall of considerable proportion, that had where the helmet, judging from where the hole that he dug to recover the helmet, it was possible to work out that it had actually fallen from a post, one of the supporting posts for the roof of the hole. And it had one eye at that time. The other eye had been taken out sometime prior to the destruction of the hall, because it had been buried in the floor of the hall as part of a foundation deposit. Such sort of place where in other circumstances one might find a gold bracteate, for example. These are the kinds of things that were put into the foundation deposits for these halls, been deliberately buried there, and then the destruction layer of the hall was a later occurrence. So it wasn't an accidental loss, it's been deliberately removed. There was a handful of other exciting things from the destruction of the hall. Four big Roman drinking vessels, a silver brooch, some dress fittings, a silver bracteate. So the person who owned the hall was clearly a person of wealth, and the community that used it had access to the kinds of resources that allowed these things to appear in society. This wasn't the only helmet-based item that was found in that area. In the 1880s, the eyebrow of a helmet, this thing on the right here, was discovered and handed into the museum, very appropriately. It was already broken when it was found, and it's made from iron. It's the eyebrow of a helmet, like this one from that's the Vinv Mound 1 helmet, sort of not an identical form of eyebrow, but it's that kind of thing. It's a very showy way of finishing off and protecting the eye. And it's made of iron, and the strips that are inlaid into it are silver, and it terminates in a beast head. I say this silver, they don't look silver, do they? They've got a very golden or yellowish patination to them. I haven't seen the thing personally to determine this, but that kind of patination, that golden tone, is absolutely typical of a river find. Things that come out of the Thames at the mudlarks hand into Museum of London, very often have this golden patination too. So the fact that it's a yellowish tinge now doesn't mean it isn't silver. This thing is 4 centimeters long, so yeah, it's a decent size, and it clearly followed. It was attached to a helmet. It's so tempting to think that maybe the chap who owned the hall, who was the officiant in all the ceremonies there, was wearing this helmet, and when the attack happened, he stormed out and threw himself at the enemy and was cut down, and the helmet received the damage in that process. We can't say that that's true, but it's certainly possible given the highly militarized nature of society in the 6th century in Scandinavia, and all the intertribal, regional warfare that was going on, which we know from other evidence resulted in pretty much every society losing large numbers of its members due to an economic downturn, due to a climatic downturn, due to the effects of plague, and who knows what other factors were going on. But they all combined to almost wipe out Scandinavian society in the middle years of the 500s. And one among many men's process. He was one of the losers. There were some winners. The Swedes based up around Stockholm were winners. The Danes in Copenhagen were winners, not in Copenhagen, but Lejre were winners. But there were a lot of losers at that time. Speaking of which, speaking of helmets, on Oland, which is a long, thin island sitting more or less between Gotland and the Swedish mainland, a series of 4 dies were found in the 1870s. These are dies. These are the masters from which plates can be made by the repoussé process. They're pressed into foil, basically, and the design is transferred by this process, like minting a coin. And these small dies were we believe used to make the plates that appear on helmets. They're of the right dimension. That there are helmets that bear not these designs, but not these exact designs, but something very similar. The top left design with the 2 chaps in procession with boars on as crests on the helmets, and the leading chap there's got a ring-hilted sword. I mean, that puts it very firmly into the 6th, early 7th century, if that had turned up in England. The chronology in Scandinavia, a little bit difficult to determine. It's clearly the same sort of time, 5th, 6th, maybe early 7th century. And the images we've got there, 2 chaps in procession, wielding and showing off their weapons. Another chap attempting to chain, is it a chain or is it a rope? Secure or fasten or fetter in some way a wild beast of some description. Another chap, maybe the same chap, he looks very similar, in a precarious position between 2 wild beasts, and him stabbing one of them. And then bottom left here, another procession, which has been drawn out by my friend Lindsay Kerr in some detail, so you can see what's going on. You've got, is it a procession, a dance? I mean, who knows? But it's clearly, this isn't normal everyday life, I suspect. People didn't generally walk around wearing mantles made from wolf skin, but he's clearly not a wolf, it's a man, because he's carrying a spear and drawing a sword. So is this a man in the process of becoming a wolf, or is he just wearing a wolf covering? Who knows? We don't have the originating story, but it's tantalizing. But the chap in front of him with his legs in that very awkward running, skipping, jumping, hopping kind of pose. Very odd. He's wearing this, I, I hesitate to call it a helmet because nothing has ever appeared in the archaeology that quite matches it. It's got a faceplate as if it were a helmet like a Sutton Hoo or one of those Vendel helmets. But it's also got this sort of crescent moon thing above it, ending in bird head. Is that something that was actually there? Did they actually wear helmets like this? Or is this a way of showing sanctity? Is it like a saint's nimbus, a saint's halo? That it's not really there physically, but it's a means of displaying possession by the god or favor of the god. I mean, we don't know, but you know, it's interesting to speculate because the casting was originally quite perfectly made, but at some point somebody came along and chiseled out one of the eye. We know the eye was a microscopic examination shows that the eye was there, but it just isn't anymore. It's been removed deliberately. It's a case of eye modification, which is a recurrent theme. We've seen it at Vinv. Here it is at Tuslunda. And it's there at Sutton Hoo as well, as I'm sure many of you know. The site at Sutton Hoo. This is a very old image of Sutton Hoo prior to the erection of the new visitor centre. The first time I visited in about, gosh, 1991, 1992, there were two little huts. That was all you had. That's where you bought your ticket, and they left you to it. Really, you could just wander around and do what you liked there. The mounds, the big circled mound is Mound 1, where the large ship burial was. The other mound here with the sort of gusset in it, sort of crease in the top, that's the excavation trench from Basil Brown's 1938 trial excavation of Mound 2. Mound 2 had also contained a ship. The other mounds, some of them have never been opened. Some of them were robbed out in antiquity. Some of them were robbed out Tudor times. And some of them we just don't know. There may be surprises there still awaiting. That's what Mound 2 looks like today on an early morning with the mist and the sun coming up at the back of it. It was there were subsequent excavations in the late 80s, early 90s under Martin Carver. And one of the experiments that he wanted to do was to have a go at recreating what these mounds looked like when they were fresh. And what they found out fairly quickly was there's a lot more to building a mound than just heaping the earth up, because the mound was built up to quite some height. And after the first few showers of rain, it all started to trickle down and dissolve, really. So respect for the mound builders back in the 7th century. They did a cracking job, and those things lasted for a very long time. The helmet. I'm going on about helmets, but sometimes they're important. Another version of a Roman cavalry helmet, but given a new spin, because in the 7th century they were doing that kind of thing, taking old Roman and classical design and doing something new with it. And as we all know, the Sutton Hoo helmet has this stylized face with the nose, the moustache, the eyebrows. Equally obvious when you look at it, the face is a bird, because you've got the two wings, the bird's head between the eyebrows, there just above the eyebrows. The body of the bird is the nose, and the moustache is the tail. Less obvious, I hope you can see this, on this museum quality repro. The eyebrows have, on the underside there, a row of garnets set into square cells. In the Sutton Hoo treasure as a whole, there are upwards of 4,000 garnets. And of those, they all have, without exception, a little gold foil placed behind to give them sparkle, like a bicycle reflector. They reflect the light, they scatter the light, they sparkle and glitter. All of them have that, except for the ones under the left eye there, and the corresponding garnet of the bird above. So what does that mean? They're suggesting that there's something odd, something different about the eye, which you might think, well, maybe it was a mistake. Maybe the thing was damaged and the garnets fell out and they put them back in wrong. Well, the chap that made that helmet, if he'd made a mistake, if it was a Friday afternoon job and he'd kind of not done his best work with it, he could have fixed it. And it's no big deal to take a few garnets out, put the foils in and put them back. If you can make that helmet, fiddling with a few garnets is no big deal at all. So it has to be, I would contend, it has to be the case that those garnets were, those foils were omitted on purpose. The eyes were interfered with, were modified. There's something special about one eye of the face there. And given that the royal family of the East Angles looked back to their progenitor, their establishing ancestor, as Woden, we know this from the pedigree, king list, then it seems, the conclusion seems unavoidable that this is a reference to the modified eye of the god. And given that the helmet must have been the centerpiece of the king's war gear, that in itself points in the same direction as the modified eye at Helvi and at Tuslunda. But it's not the only example of a modified eye at Sutton Hoo. We have the stone. It's usually, sometimes it's called a whetstone, sometimes it's called a scepter. It's certainly not a whetstone. I've used that type of stone and tried to spark from it, and it doesn't work. It's just not. Is it a scepter? It depends what you mean by scepter, really. It's a symbol of power. Absolutely it is. There's nothing like that anywhere in the archaeology of Northern Europe. It's beautifully, carefully constructed or carved in such a way that the whole thing is perfectly balanced. If you stand it down on its base, it just remains standing. Almost magical, really, in terms of an item made by a barbarian people, so to speak. Each end of the bar has a bulb, finishes in a bulb, and below the bulb, on each face, there's a carved mask, a carved face looking outwards. 8 of them for the eight faces. The lower end has a little foot, as I said. The upper end has an iron ring, a swiveling joint, and a bronze stag. What the significance of that is, I don't know. I'm thinking Helrot. It's, but I don't know. That's a supposition too far. But what we do know is the carved faces at the bottom end, the south end. Most of them are like this. They have this one's a particularly rounded, almost female-looking face with copious hair and a beard under the chin. But on face B1, which is to say that one of the lower faces, the left eye has been flattened off. You can't. It's not easy to see in photos. These are carinated. The profile of the eye comes out to a ridge almost on the right eye and on all the other eyes, but not the left eye, face B1. You can see it in this photograph fairly clearly. This is the carinated eye, which is unamended, and the one on on the left eye there, on the right, is has been flattened off. Now, is that accidental damage? If the thing had fallen over, could it have just sustained a knock and the eye being knocked out accidentally? Not really, because the brow ridge protects the eye above, the nose protects the eye on that side, and you've got another raised ridge under the eye for the eyelid. So it's almost impossible to get a tool into that little wedge-shaped gap to dig the eye out. It can't have been accidental. It's deliberate modification of the eye there. If we had a whole day on this, I could talk you through a load of other things Sutton Hoo that have odd things about them, little faces buried in the iconography. But we haven't got all day, so we'll move briskly back to Vindeleb. This is, I don't know if this is relevant or not, but I'm including it for your background knowledge. One of the other bracteates, the Vindeleb, number IK735, it's got this profile bust, a normal thing on many bracteates. It's got the bands of punch design on the outside, but it's also got some symbols underneath. A thing that looks like a hammer with a ring at the end. The rune, the teal rune, inverted, a triskele, and the Os rune, the Unsus rune, inverted. The meaning of the teal rune, the name of the teal rune, is the god's name, teal. The name of the Unsus rune, it means a god. Doesn't specify which god, but the member of the Aesir, the god who has the closest association with runes, is usually Woden. So it seems plausible that something is connected in some way to the worship of the Aesir. One can say no more. But it's interesting. Equally interesting is this fragment of stone from a place called Slingnes in Norway, which was found in the when modifications were made to an old farmhouse, which and this thing was dismissed by the authorities, found back in the 1960s, and it was considered to be a fake, because how could you possibly, what's the purpose of it, and why would you have a piece of stone with the text on it, Erilas Wodin? It seems too improbable, too good to be true. And if things are too good to be true, if they seem too good to be true, chances are they are too good to be true. But closer analysis of the carving techniques more recently have shown that it's perfectly consistent with an early medieval 5th or 6th century date. Linguistically, yeah, I mean, you can squint a bit. It says Wodin, doesn't have a final vowel between the N and the Z, but that in itself can't condemn it. Misspelling and miscopying is absolutely normal. It would be far more suspicious if it were perfectly spelled. And we've got the word, well, we've got most of the word Erilas. We're missing the first rune there. Erilas is we haven't time to go into it today, but it's associated with lots of things to do with the wild hunt. It's with a particularly violent and widely respected southern Scandinavian tribe, and there are reasons for thinking that the name Erilas means something like priest or hallowed one, that kind of thing. We've looked at masks just in passing. Button brooch from Sussex. Button brooches are a garment fastener. It's about 20 mil across, 3/4 of an inch across, so not much bigger than a thumbnail, but they've managed to cram all this detail in, and they've got one pellet eye, one round eye, and a lentoid, a bean-shaped eye, but it's been put in north-south instead of east-west, which would be the normal way of doing it. Does it mean anything? I don't know. It's tiny. who could possibly have seen that when the thing was fresh? But tiny details are absolutely what these people traded in. When you study the when you study the riddles, for example, tiny details in the text, in the wording used, the possible multiple meanings of one word are exactly the kinds of things that they're looking for, that they use to convey information which allows you to solve the riddle. And I suspect something like that. Yeah. Now, this is a bow brooch here on the right. A bow or an ansate brooch, if you're technical. It's got the same design at both ends. And it shows a bearded head surrounded or flanked or hooded, perhaps, by two stylized bird heads. But they're not just any old bird heads. These are very, very specific type with a hooked beak and a sort of L-shaped bracket that sits behind the eye, which is absolutely typical of the kinds of artistic depiction of birds that occur in the 6th and 7th century in Northern Europe. On the Sutton Hoo shield, for example, there's this bird image. The head of it is shown larger here with this bracket, exactly as seen on the brooch. On the reverse of the shield, there's another example of the bird, less ornate, less showy, but the same thing. And what's remarkable about this is that it wasn't found in England or Germany or Scandinavia. It's found at a place called Cividale in Friuli, in Italy, a little bit north of Venice, in the foothills of the Alps. And that part of the world was settled in the 6th century by people calling themselves Lombards, Langobardi. And that's significant in itself, because the Langobardi, their early history is written up by Paulus Diaconus using earlier sources, an anonymous work called the Origo Gentis Langobardorum, Origin of the Lombardy. And one of the stories in that voluminous work, it talks about the early history, the origins of a tribe called the Winiles, who set out from somewhere in the north, somewhere near the Rhine, and on their travels they came up against the Vandals, who demanded tribute from them. And the Winiles told them that they're not going to pay, and they offered to settle the dispute by trial of combat. So the Vandals, wishing to be sure that they were going to secure victory, asked their god Godan for help. But the Winiles, being a bit crafty, asked Freya, his wife, who suggested that they should array their women for battle and have their long hair drawn around their mouths so that they would appear to be masculine. And then when Gordon woke up, he asked, "Who are these long beards?" And under the rules of hospitality, having named them, he was obliged to give them victory. I wonder whether these images from the Sutton Hoo stone are related in any way. Can't prove it, but beyond that, it's not an accident, I would suggest, that the name Longbeard, Langbard, is one of the bynames, one of the nicknames by which Odin called the Scandinavian source. Langbard is the exact cognate of Langobardi, and therefore a Lombard. Suggestive rather than conclusive, but you get enough suggestions and it all kinds to add up. A rather humble thing, a scabbard-shaped fitting at the bottom of a sword scabbard, and it just serves to protect the bottom and stop it getting split and damaged when it hits the ground. They're humble little things of no great consequence, but a number of them are made as if it's a facing mask, a human face, or a male face, shall we say, with a rather lovely beard and moustache, possibly a long beard, wouldn't say, but flanked by two stylized bird heads. So is this our favourite gentleman flanked by Hugin and Munin? Again, there's nothing written anywhere that suggests that it is, but there's no real reason to discount that as evidence, because it was the society that produced this item was familiar with those tales, or an earlier version. And if archaeological evidence doesn't satisfy you and you want to see something written, we have a brooch from Nordendorf, which is southern Germany, I believe, Alemannic territory. Not in itself a remarkable brooch, silver gilt. There are dozens, if not hundreds, of a similar type recovered, from that kind of territory and places further north. Squared in bow brooch, nothing remarkable. But on the reverse of the head plate, some runic inscription, Awa Lejre, written upside down. The brooches, when they're displayed in museums and catalogues and so on, always have the square plate at the top and the triangular plate at the bottom. But in use, they were worn the other way around. We know this from depictions of, for example, the Roman general Stilicho wearing a bow brooch, not this type, but something similar. And he wears it with what we call the head plate at the bottom and what we call the foot plate at the top. And in graves, they usually appear like that as well. So the inscription Awa Lejre, two personal names. Awa is probably a female name. Lejre, or in Old English, Lejre, dear friend. It's, who knows, there's probably a story there. But more interestingly, from our point of view, three other names, Logathore, Woden, and Wigithonar. And if Thonar is assumed to be the same as Thunor or Thor, Wigi, well, can this be Thor who consecrates, Wigan to consecrate, or Wigan to fight? Is it Thor the battler? Maybe. Logathore, well, maybe can cognate with the name of the god Lothor, who turns up in Snorri's writing in the 13th century. But there's also an Old English word meaning a snake charmer or a kind of witch or supernatural type with a similar name. So inconclusive. But the name is Woden. It's correctly spelt, and it's most definitely there. The grave was discovered in the late 1800s, undisturbed. So that item has been in the ground for 1300 years without intervention. There's no possibility that it's been interfered with in the 20th century or before for mischief purposes. It's definitely right. One recurrent aspect to the cult of Woden is drink. Oddly enough, I can't think why that would be popular, but there we are. Particularly in the area of Bregenz in Austria, the Saint Columbus was wont to go around spreading the word of Christ, caused peregrination of a saint, of basically stopping the locals from doing things that they wanted to do and correcting their behaviour as he saw it. And one of the things that he came across was a group of people, Swabians, who were setting up a kupa, a barrel, basically, of beer. And they'd set it up and they were about to undertake some religious rite. It doesn't actually say what they were going to do, but clearly sharing out the beer was part of their religious observance. And this was going to happen in honour of a god of theirs by name Woden, whom others called Mercurius. And that in itself is an interesting observation. It's the first time the equation made between Woden on the one hand and Mercury, Mercurius on the other. And Mercury is a very interesting Roman god. There's no big temples to Mercury in Rome. He's not a major factor in Roman religion in the narrow sense, but the military absolutely loved Mercury. Mercury and Mithras were their big hero. Temples to Mercury, effigies of Mercury turn up. Northern Gaul, Britain, and the Rhineland, mainly. Those are the areas where they proliferate. Being a bit of a spoil sport, Columbanus blows onto the vessel, and miraculously it splits into fragments and the beer flows out. And these people go away disappointed, which is what he wanted at first. But what it says is a devil was hidden in that vessel who, through the unholy liquid, would seize the souls of the participants. Interesting that that Columbanus has caught on to the fact that this is a religious rather than a social occasion, and that it's the beer, the holy liquid, that is going to form their sacrament, really, their means of getting in touch with the other world, which is, you know, not an insignificant thing. I can see the time's getting on, and I'm flagging as much as you are, so I'll whiz through the next bit. Textus Referensis is a early 12th century document, but it includes copies of much earlier text, one of which is the pedigree or king list of the East Angles, ending with Ulfwald. So he presumably was the chap who commissioned it, and he died in 749. So that gives you an idea of how old it is. Interesting list of names here. If Sam Newton were with us, he would be in ecstasy, because Hrothmund is mentioned. Hrothmund is he's there. Hrothmund Trieli, a prince of the East Angles, then one assumes, but his name, a man of the same name, appears in Beowulf. So that's interesting. We've also got a chap called Tytla, Tytla Wulfing, son of Wulfa. By triangulating the names that we know that Eni, for example, it was around sometime in the early years of the 7th century. So Tytla was probably around 25 to 30 years prior, roughly, which means that he was given his name in the middle years of the 500s. Tytla is the anglicised version, the Old English version of the name Totila, who was a king of the Ostrogoths. And in fact, he was the last king of the Ostrogoths of any note. He died magnificently in the Battle of Bustagalorum in 552, and probably his name went into legendary history. His name was that of a hero of old who died doing the right thing, and therefore he became a person after whom it would be appropriate to name a prince. Exactly what we have with Tytla in the Anglian kingdom. But they go back through lots of interesting names, through Caesar, clearly Caesar, to Woden, Kaiser Woden, Kaiser son of Woden, and then Woden Frealabing at the bottom. So we have, therefore, evidence that the East Angles regarded Woden as their initiating, their apical ancestor, if you like. And we have the evidence from Sutton Hoo of the eye modification on the helmet, elsewhere in the war gear, including the stone. So that all ties together quite satisfactorily, perhaps. There's one big name missing, which is the name that everybody knows in connection with the East Angles of Sutton Hoo. That's the name Radwald. He doesn't feature here. Radwald is the brother of Eni, but N is the ancestor of Ulfwald, so that's why it had Rolls. B doesn't really mention Woden at all by name. It turns up once when he's talking about the background to the Angles' first leaders, Hengist and Horsa, but that's the only time he's named. There's strong supposition that there are references to Woden in what Bede has to say about the early life of King Edwin, for example, and the mysterious stranger who turns up when he's at his lowest ebb, sort of turns his life around for him, or the mysterious stranger who turns up when the cow herd Cadmon is at his lowest ebb and needs the gift of poetry, and he receives a visit from him in a dream from a mysterious visitor. So there's lots of evidence there. If you squint a bit and don't ask too many questions, you can sort of get the feeling that there's something behind. There's stuff that Bede isn't telling us. He's giving us an edited version of the story. The only direct reference there in that kingdom. But we're on firmer ground with a fragment of human skull from Ribe, which is on the Danish-German border, dated to the 9th century or the 8th century, about 800 actually, is the date of the thing by archaeological assessment. And it says quite clearly, Ulfr auk Odin. Those are the first three words of the inscription. So Ulf, the wolf, and Odin. And fortunately, it does have the Danish form of the name, Scandinavian form. It's no longer in this part of the world Woden. It's become Odin or Odin. So the paths are sundered. Woden with a W and Odin with an O are no longer considered the same identical personage. But about the same time, there's a record of a renunciation formula for when one becomes a Christian and wishes to no longer be subject to the previous regime. There's a form of words that one has to use to repudiate all the baddies that to show respect for, and amongst these we have Ekforsacho alam Jovelis Werkum and Wordum Thunar and de Woden and Saxnote and the alum them unhodum, the here genetasim. I forsake all the devil's words, Thunor and Woden and Saxnot, all the unholy ones who are their companions. Saxnot, oddly enough, appears in England as one of the ancestors of the kings of Essex. So not made up. There's other evidence. And it's a group of three gods, which is another recurrent feature that we haven't got time to look at today. Right. Woden is there in the Nine Herbs Charm in the Larknunga manuscript. The Larknung is a medical book on medical treatments, and there's an episode there where Woden fights a snake. Don't have time really to go into the details of that today. In the Exeter book, we learn in one of the poems, which is part of the sort of poems of wisdom and learning, to paraphrase Professor Shippey, a poem of wisdom and learning called Maxim 1. In section B, it says, Woden workte Wales, Wuldor Alwalda Rume Roderas. Depends how you parse that. Is that Woden made idle? The all ruler, the Alwalda, made glory, the broad heaven, or is Woden in apposition with Alwalda? I just throw it out there. I make no suggestion other than that it's a possibility that needs exploring, really. Is it that Woden, the almighty wielder of glory, made the broad heaven? The image there is not a Welch. A Welch is a an idol or an object of veneration. This, it no longer exists. The it's a large standing stone that used to stand in the Ness of Brodgar and Orkney, which is a I think Neolithic sacred site where a number of standing stones exist. One of which, this one with an eye, with a single eye, a hole in it, was called into recent times the Woden Stone, Wodden, sometimes written Odin Stone, Odin. And there's been a lot of speculation about this, and I've included it in my book for the sake of completeness. I'm not convinced that the name Odin Stone has anything to do with anything. I think Woden Stone is actually the local pronunciation of wedding, because when local couples were married, they did so, or made vows to each other, they did so by holding right hand through the hole in the stone. So it's probably no more than coincidence, but we've seen so many coincidences, the coincidences of the modified eye and so on. Who knows? It's tantalizing, but it's not conclusive in it. And then just before we close, this thing, the Lejre figurine, which is a whole 18 millimeters high. So it's a tiny, tiny little silver, looks like a thing off a charm bracelet. Very interesting. Found in 2009 at Lejre, which, as we know, was a cult site in pre-Christian times. And it immediately was hailed as, it's a figure of Woden because it's flanked by two birds and sitting on the high seat. But I really don't buy it. The costume of the figure is clearly female. Got ankle length or floor length dress, tiered necklaces of beads, and then a sort of raised collar and a sort of short mantle. Very similar to the kinds of female costume you'd expect from the 9th or 10th century. And it's got two eyes, two big eyes. You can't say that a thing is definitely not Woden because it's got two eyes, but you would think on something, a thing of as detailed as this, that they would have included some detail that would sort of point the way. Some people have said, oh, maybe it's Freya then. I don't think it's Freya either, because she's associated with cats. What you've got here are birds, and the back of the chair looks like they look like seals to me. Can't be entirely sure. But I suspect that this is Frigg, who is the apical female figure in Asgard. And she's very demure and she's usually well turned out. And, she's sitting on Odin's seat, but it's definitely a female. Could it be a gender transgressive figure? You can't say no, really. There's no evidence. And another thing that sometimes turns up in discussions is this is a pendant from a place called Tuslunda in Denmark, hailed as a mask of Odin. Really, it's one of the eyes is a little bit. It's not the same as the other, shall we say? But I think that's just abrasion. I think it's just random damage. It's just the passage of time that's affected the eye. And when you realise that Tisu means the lake of the god Tyr, I mean that sort of points in a different direction, doesn't it? So there's reason for reasonable doubt, I would guess. 9th, 10th century again. Has got a long beard though. Lombard. Who knows? Who knows? There have been an awful lot of books about not so much Woden, I have to say, but Odin and his place in the northern pantheon, and retellings of the myths and examinations of the elements of his stories and his what we can recover of the the praxis, the way he was worshipped. So, do we really need another one? Well, actually, we haven't had one on Woden, the earlier part of the story, for a very long time, I would say. And given that Professor Nydorf and Professor Chippy have both been doing a lot of very valuable work in this area, and new things have come to light from the archaeology, of course, but from just re-examining existing texts and just taking a fresh look at them. I've done no more than bring together a lot of disparate information and then try to give some pointers as to how one might approach it and interpret it. It doesn't only cover Woden. It does extend through into the Scandinavian material, and it also looks at some Roman period stuff, some epigraphic material, and some iconography, and a fresh look at some of the things that Tacitus has to say. But yeah, it's well, you can see what I've been dealing with. These are the sources that I've called upon for the book. So there's a fair bit there, as you can see. Some of it tangential, some of it mentioned in passing, some of it absolutely crucial to the story. But I leave you with it as it is and say no more than it's stonkia eure here, and I could do with a drink, and I'm sure you could too. So maybe